Today we are going to be looking at a folktale story that is part of our genre of fiction. And the first thing I want us to take note of is the title. The title of our story is A Shepherd's Tale. Remember, the title will always give us an indication of what this story may be about. Now, notice it says it is an excerpt from. So that means we are not seeing the very beginning of the story or necessarily middle of the story or the end of story. We are seeing a small portion of our story. So our title is A Shepherd's Mistake, Folktale. Folktales often, we know, try to answer questions or give lessons that the people of the time wanted to learn. It also, they also taught morals. They were told orally. So, and we know from our earlier discussions that orally means by word of mouth. So let's first go through and let's number our paragraphs. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs. So now that we've numbered our paragraphs, let's go through and let's read our story just to get the gist. And remember, we're reading to get the gist just so we know what the story is saying. We're not reading necessarily to pull out any extra information. So the question we have in mind is, what type of lesson do we think this folktale may be about? And we pulled that question from the fact that we have the title says, A Shepherd's Mistake, a folktale. So as we're reading, please follow along very carefully and taking note of how fast I read or how slow I read. And also underline any words in which you may need to define. Early every morning, a shepherd took his flock of sheep out in the fields to graze. He would sit by watching as the sheep lazily munched on fresh grass. After they had eaten, he would round them up and walk back home. Sometimes, while watching his flock, he would curl up in a quiet corner and go off to sleep. One day, the shepherd caught a wolf which had strayed into the field, eyeing his sheep. However, it was some distance away and it made no effort to come nearer. The shepherd at first stood on guard against the wolf, as against an enemy, and kept a strict watch over its movements. But the wolf did not do anything, and when the shepherd herded the sheep and headed home with his flock, the wolf quietly followed them at a distance. This continued for a while, and the shepherd would find the wolf waiting at the edge of the field every morning. But it made not the slightest effort to seize the sheep, and would just watch. So, by and by, the shepherd let his guard down a bit. A few days later, he began to actually look forward to the wolf's presence. Well, let's first take a look and see if there's any words in which we would like to define within our story. Well, the word munched might be a difficult word to define. So, let's think about our context clues. Often, we know that we could find the definition of a word that we may not know the meaning of by looking in the sentence before the word or looking in the sentence after the word, looking for the word or looking for the word called. Or if we can think of a synonym or an antonym to the word. Well, let's take a look. That word munched that we see in paragraph 1 is included in the sentence where they say, as the sheep lazily munched on fresh grass. Well, we could assume that the word munched may mean to eat on fresh grass. Well, let's look and see if we see that in the sentence prior to this. Well, we see graze, and we know from our prior knowledge that sheep go to fields to graze or to eat. So the word munched may mean eat. But let's look at the sentence after the word. After they had eaten. Well, again, we know that they must have eaten, and we know from our prior knowledge about sheep that they eat mostly grass. So therefore that word munched means to eat or eat on fresh grass. Let's go through and let's see if there's any other words that we might need help defining. One day the shepherd caught a wolf which had strayed into the field, eyeing his sheep. Well, the word strayed may mean wandered around. So, the shepherd caught a wolf which had strayed. Let's pause the video, and I would like for you to go get a dictionary to help you define the word strayed. So, strayed means the word strayed means to deviate from the direct course, leave the proper place, or go beyond the proper limits, especially without a fixed course or purpose, to wander or to roam. Our third definition says to go astray, deviate as from a moral, religious, or philosophical course. Well, let's look at our second definition, to wander or to roam. Let's see if we can input to wander into our sentence and see if the word strayed means to wander. One day, the shepherd caught a wolf which had wandered into the field. So we know that the word strayed must mean to wander, because the word wander makes sense in our sentence. Are there any other words that you need to define? If so, please pause the video at this time, look in your dictionary, and look up those words. Okay, now let's take a look at our questions. What do you infer the wolf will do later in the story, and why? That word infer is asking that we take a look at what we've read and use our background knowledge about what we know and place those two things together in order to come up with a educated thought about what may happen next. So what do you infer the wolf will do later in the story? And remember, we already identified that this story is simply an excerpt. That means there is more to be said if we were to read the completed story. Well, I would infer, based off of my knowledge about wolves, that wolves come near sheep whenever they are hungry. So when the wolf strayed into the field, eyeing his sheep, I would infer that the wolf was hungry at that time. However, he saw the shepherd was on guard or was ready for him as against an enemy. That word against an enemy means he was willing to protect the sheep from the wolf. So he kept a strict watch over them at first, and it's a strict watch over its movement. It's being the wolves. So our wolf didn't decide to do anything at this time. And he kept wondering and wondering and just coming over and simply watching the sheep. So I believe later on in our story, the wolf will eventually attack the sheep and eat them. And I can also make that inference because it says a shepherd's mistake. So what would be the mistake that a shepherd might have made? Well, remember, we've already said, based off of our knowledge about wolves and sheep's relationship, that the wolf normally would eat the sheep. So if at the end of our story, the shepherd began to actually... So let's continue. So Our wolf actually is looking forward to the wolf's presence. That lets us know that, based off of our title, this might be the shepherd's mistake, because we know based off of our prior knowledge that wolves are the natural enemy of a sheep and its shepherd, because the wolf's purpose is to eat the sheep. So, what do you infer the wolf will do later in the story, and why? Well, I would infer that the wolf is going to eat the sheep. And so that's what I'm going to write there. Oops. The wolf will attack and the sheep because the shepherd relaxes and the shepherd relaxes and no longer sees him as a an enemy. So that is our first question. What do we infer the wolf will do later in the story? The wolf will attack and eat the sheep because the shepherd relaxes and no longer sees him as an enemy. So our next question asks us to complete the cause and effect chart. Well, we know from our previous discussions with nonfiction text structures that when we are looking at the cause and effect, we are asking, well, what happened? And then we're looking back to see what made it happen. Well, in our story, the effect is the shepherd let his guard down. So what made the shepherd let his guard down? So let's look at paragraphs. Let's look at paragraph 4. This continued for a while, and the shepherd would find the wolf waiting at the edge of the field every morning. But it made not the slightest effort to seize the sheep and would just watch. So by and by, the shepherd let his guard down. A few days later, he began to actually look forward to the wolf's presence. Well, what happened? Well, the shepherd let his guard down. Well, what made the shepherd let his guard down? Well, the wolf the wolf never, let's not say never, the wolf doesn't attack the sheep. So the wolf not attacking the sheep is what made the shepherd let his guard down. So what do you think the main idea of this passage is? Remember, main idea is what the passage is mostly about. So again, we're going to go back up to our story and we're going to read it to try to see if we can identify the main idea or what each paragraph is mostly about. Where early every morning a shepherd took his flock of sheep out in the field to graze. They would sit by watching as the sheep lazily munched on the fresh grass. After they had eaten, he would round them up and walk home. Sometimes while watching his flock, he would curl up in a quiet corner and go off to sleep. One day the shepherd caught a wolf, which was straight into the field eyeing his sheep. However, it was some distance away and it made no effort to come nearer. The shepherd at first stood on guard against the wolf, as against an enemy, and kept a strict watch over its movements. But the wolf did not do anything. When the shepherd herded the sheep and headed home with his flock, the wolf quietly followed them at a distance. This continued for a while. The shepherd would find the wolf waiting at the edge of the field every morning, but it made not the slightest effort to seize the sheep, and would just watch. So by and by, the shepherd would let his guard down. A few days later, he began to actually look forward to the wolf's presence. Well, what do we think the main idea of this story is? Well, The main idea is there was a shepherd who began to trust a wolf. Do we agree that that is what this story is mainly about? Yes, I think so. Now let's ask a further question. What do you think the theme is? What do you think the shepherd's mistake was? And what lesson do you think he learned? Discuss with your partner those two questions. What is the theme or the lesson learned within our story? And then what do you think his ultimate mistake was? Please use the information from this lesson to help you complete the follow-up activity found in our folktale lesson center. Thank you.